I mean, I'm always looking for synergy between the player's feelings and knowledge and emotion and the character's feelings and knowledge and emotion.
Mm,
As much as you can get the player and Gia to be thinking and feeling the same thing, if you can do that, you're golden. Like, if anyone is looking for the game development narrative tips, that's what it all comes down to. Have Gia asking the same questions, investigating the same leads the player is asking and investigating of themselves. And yeah, those same moments where Gia goes, geez, I really want to get off this island, where it's so the danger disappears. The player's thinking the exact same thing.
yeah.
I've got a lot of loot that I'm trying to, keep safe as well. So
All right, guys. Well, welcome back to another Aether Hour. We are officially naming these weekly AMAs, and this time we have some of our co-development partners from Chaos Theory. We've got James, and we have Dean. And James is our producer over there, and Dean is the senior game designer. So they are kind of making all the magic happen in terms of building the game in Unity, as you can see. And we're going to talk about some cool, behind the scenes development stuff today. So, I guess maybe we just start off with like, what has been a really difficult thing to put together with this game? Has there been a very standout? Is it the combat? Is it the dialogue system? Is it a bit of everything? Do you guys have something off the top of your head that's like, man, this has been tough?
Probably a few
challenging
things
things.
that fit that
Yeah.
bill. Yeah, I think the combat and the dialogue are probably top of that list. Well, combat has probably been about 50% of the dev budget of this game, just because there's a lot mechanically going on in that part of gameplay, and I think we're trying to do a few unique things in combat that mean that we've spent a lot of time innovating, tinkering, figuring out a lot of stuff that didn't work over the last couple of years of development. And yeah, I think the whole moving environment thing is really not something you see in many turn-based tactics or turn-based strategy games, which has presented its own sort of unique challenges, like UX around lane warnings and kind of all of the obstacles only having temporary visibility when they have their turn on the grid, or dynamic like obstacles like other civilians sort of moving around between their turns. And I think a lot of that has been challenging to tune to get right. And we're still putting final touches on trying to get that right, but at least based on some of the feedback from the demo so far, some players seem to appreciate what's going on there.
Yeah, and finding these kind of fun discoveries, because thinking through how would movement points and things work with vehicles where, if you're putting your foot down and accelerating to move forward, you're probably going to be spending more fuel and a bit more AP than if you like try to fall back. So that creates some really interesting dynamics that aren't found in other games with turn-based combat. And then you go, well, that's a thing that makes sense, and that probably sounds cool, but you've got to test it, and you've got to know like what actually spins out of that. Things where you're just like, if we lean into that, we can make that really great, but needing to find the ways to what other pieces need to go along with it. For me, the challenge that started before even diving into is it combat, is it dialogue, was because it is such a unique game. What is the balance of these pieces? Like, we've got kind of three main components, I would say. Oh, probably more if you consider things like inventory management and the smuggling aspects. But between the exploration, the combat, and that dialogue, this question of, what's the balance of this game going to be? Because we're kind of stepping outside of genres, really combining a lot of different genres. And you can see the way players are reacting to the demo. People are recognizing that it is kind of a special and unique game. And so really getting a sense of what should those balance be. Like every time you hit a new, I love it. Even as we're developing it, I'm jumping ahead now to the really good stuff, but I can't help it. The art is so amazing, and we've been spending years looking at like black and white pieces, placeholder works, and you're coming along and testing and building a bit of content, and it becomes a bit, it's just part of the job. And then one day you come along and you explore across the map and enter a new location, and that's the day that the art has gone in.
Yep.
and it just hits
Yeah.
you for the first time. And so those moments of exploration are great, and really figuring out how often do we have those, how deep do we get into our conversations, and when do we surprise the player with the combat. That was the first major challenge to kind of work through there.
So I'm curious how a combat system like this even starts. Like, what is the first piece? Like, what was like the prototype of something like this? Because I know you're not like making 10 million cars to start. You're not like, I don't even know if
Mm.
you had the moving road system yet. Like, was it just like flat pieces, almost like chess pieces, moving them around and seeing how they could interact? Like, how did it begin?
Yeah.
It starts on paper. You
Okay.
start drawing some grids and you start moving some things around and sitting there scratching your head going like, what should some of these rules be? Before we build anything, it's a matter of how can we prototype it cheaply and quickly,
Mm.
because you want to be able to not have to get married to ideas, be able to explore things really freely, and just throwing around bits of paper. We're an office full of, well, office and remote, filled with people who love games and have had a lot of experience building games. So you can sit there and you don't have the structure of a game codifying the rules in front of you, but you kind of imagine what would be nice sets of rules. We can all kind of agree on what would work and talk it through and like paper prototype a lot of these things, and then start building developmental prototypes, which is where the dev team really takes over. I don't know if you want to follow up what happens once we start building the dev prototypes there, James.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm sure I have some videos of it sitting around on this computer somewhere, but yeah, it started with a very scrappy, like 1 week prototype, to have some cars on a grid. I think it was more top down or a little bit side on at that point. And we had the scrolling background, but just some 2D assets that scrolled to give an illusion of movement. And really starting to tinker with that road positioning and the idea of like hazards or obstacles, like lane closures and things coming by, environment taking its turn were some of the early things that were involved in that. I think I do actually have some like sketches of what some of those pen and paper prototypes might have
Cool.
looked like from years and years ago. But
Yeah.
as Dean said, it's basically, here is a combat encounter. Here's some different grid arrangements, and let's see, let's try and play it out turn by turn, maybe on paper. I think we did actually have a paper prototype at one point where we just used different dice or figurines to represent different cars, and we're noting down sort of components of the action economy and stuff like that, just to get a feeling of what types of abilities, how many actions could you take per turn, how many units in a combat encounter were values that were feeling sensible. But yeah, I think it was a 2D car sprites and a 2D scrolling parallax background, and then a little bit of an ability to sort of select and move around the grid, and some obstacles and hazards and stuff like that, I think was what our 1 week prototype looked like. And then it was just progressively being added to over many, many months. I think it was probably like 4 or 5 months in that we flipped the grid to be sort of more isometric and diagonal, and really give that more of a sense of like a car chase, or the camera behind the vehicles and watching the action from a helicopter camera point of view or something like that. And that
So at that point, did you start incorporating the 3D assets, or was it still like 2D for a long time?
I think we had some of the 3D assets that were going in when it was more side on. But we were using a lot of 2D assets for all of the background imagery to sort of get a sense of the visuals. I think we had 3D vehicles at that point. But yeah, we were running into some UX challenges of, if you have the grid kind of tilted and side on and not quite top down, like selecting different grid cells that are sort of behind one another was a bit of a challenge. And so it just didn't feel very fast while you were sort of watching all of the vehicles from their side windows, more or less. So yeah, I think when we shifted the perspective, I think we still ended up having like a range of 2D building sprites that were just sort of scrolling past, sort of rendered at that perspective initially, and then started to build the 3D road elements. It was a lot simpler than what it looks like now, and we didn't have any of the intersections that are spawning in different chunks of roads and stuff like that. But
So
developing
do
it
you have
piece by
like
piece, I think.
clumps of buildings that you know will work together that start popping up, or like what is the system to ensure that like buildings aren't like overlapping each other in really terrible ways when they're spawning?
Yeah, there's sort of building spawner system that every building here has a series of like colliders around it, so it knows how big it is, and we have a sort of pool of different building options. And really trying to get the most out of our assets here, where we designed the buildings so that all of them can be rotated 90 degrees and still look good at either of those angles. And some of them can also be flipped and look good at that angle as well.
That's cool. I
And
did not know
so
that.
we've only got, maybe like 5 or 6 individual building assets, but we can rotate them any which way and sort of get almost 8 different visual variations out of them. And on top of that, there are a few things like some of these decorations can get turned on and off when they get spawned in, so the silhouette will start to look a little bit different, or some of the texturing trim, this could be green or it could be blue, depending on the variant that spawns in, so to get a little bit more visual variety there as well. But yeah, they each sort of have a collider, and they know how big they are and how much gap there is between, this part of the road and what comes next. And so it'll just pick new buildings to spawn in that available space until it tries to fill it up as much as possible. And I think in the different like baronies and environments that we have some different settings there. If we want it to feel a bit more spacious and we want the buildings to be a bit more spaced out, we can kind of tweak that. If we want it to feel a little bit more, like, I don't know, downtown Manhattan or in the middle of New York City, we want to clump them all together, we can control that as well. So, yeah, a little bit of basic physics logic, I think, to try and get those buildings spawning together, but not clipping or overlapping with each other.
That's cool. So we have a couple different things going on in the game. We've got the narration stuff, we have the combat system, we have the like car upgrade stuff. I imagine in development, like upgrading the car and doing those sorts of things, like that was later on. But like,
Yep.
Did this game start with the car combat stuff, or was it a combination of both doing story stuff and the combat stuff?
It was, I think, always a combination of both.
Yeah.
Because that was one of the really exciting things about this project, was how developed the world building and the story and everything was, and being able to come in and like Tyler, who I think everyone's met by now, has such a great ownership over those concepts and things. It was just great to spend so much time with him and just absorb all of that, and then think about like, okay, what is the most accurate and faithful way to kind of represent this world. And it seemed that the cars would be central. Certainly, well and truly, like everyone on that Seismic side is so passionate about narrative. We knew that narrative was going to be a huge component as well. So really a kind of marrying of those two.
Yeah, I think when we first met some of the early Seismic team members in 2023, there was already a sort of strong idea, a strong push for what core elements of that game might be or might look like, and the combat, and particularly the vehicular combat, was part of that, and the strong presence of a story and narrative, or we knew it was going to be a very narrative driven, character driven, story driven game. And a lot of those early months were teasing out exactly what shape that might take and how those elements would play nicely together.
On the topic of some of the vehicles in the game, Josh C. on Facebook asked us about, he says, really curious how engine upgrades factor into turn-based games. And let's assume here that we're talking about the engines in the car and not the video game engine.
Yeah, I mean, We have a bit of an identity for each of the different types of vehicle parts that you can acquire in the game. So you got engines, repulsors, weapons, and auxiliary parts, which fall into a few different sort of subcategories. So armor and other things that give you actions in combat as well. I think engines' primary identity is to sort of modulate your AP, like how many action points do you have available for your vehicle when you're taking your turn.
Big impact on weight as well. Yeah.
And on weight, yeah. So you sort of, when you're configuring parts in your vehicles, you're making a trade-off between, do I add heavier parts that maybe give me more capability, but then I'm going to be able to add fewer of them, or do I add more smaller parts, like a smaller piece of armor or a lighter weapon, so that I'll have more actions available to me in my turn, but maybe I don't have as many action points because I don't have that bigger, heavier engine, and so I can't use all of those, and I've got to be more selective. And so those engine upgrades, maybe at the beginning of the game, you're working with, I'm not sure, 6, 7, 8, 9 AP or something like that per turn, able to, move around a little bit and do 1, maybe 2 actions. Towards the end of the game, with some of those engine upgrades, you may be playing with more like 20 to 30 AP, and so you can do a lot more movement, use some of those higher AP cost abilities, and be doing a few more things on your turn, or on each of your crew members' turns before you finish.
Yeah, what's interesting is you guys touched on this a little bit earlier, but just the fact that like there's nothing really one-to-one like this. So you're kind of having to take inspiration from other tactical games just in the sense of like movement, AP, attacking, stuff like that, but then having to figure out like how does the car work? How am I going to make, upgrading the car cool is like totally like you're having to figure this stuff out from scratch, which is really interesting.
Nick, and they're flying Aether cars as well. So like the engine, this could have been one of the challenges we spoke about. The amount of iteration sitting there and like scratching our heads and thinking like, well, how does an Aether vehicle work? Where is its power being generated from? Is the engine more like a battery, or is it, it's the repulsors actually that are generating the power? So all of this kind of really deep thought trying to understand the mechanics of this stuff. And then hope that our answers or this marrying between the theory and the gameplay and making them mesh in a way that gives you a really enjoyable and almost by default pretty unique experience. But I think we're pretty happy with what we've ended up with. It's a lot of fun to play.
Oh, for sure. Were you guys referencing any other games or projects or ideas that are maybe outside the box, like that aren't other tactical games? Or is it mostly just like you come across a problem, you're like, we have to figure out how to solve this problem in the unique way because our game is so different?
I think we'll always have a pretty big reference game list.
Yeah.
There are a couple of core references, I think, for the kind of game we were going for. Citizen Sleeper and Anna Saga and games like Disco Elysium came up in that list for a little bit of like overall game tone. But even when we were going into specific gameplay mechanics and systems, it would often be a whole different set of reference lists. Like for vehicle customization, actually, we were looking at games like Armored Core 6 and Forza for like a car configuration and how do they, show off vehicles in the garage, and when you're dealing with a lot of different parts, dealing with a bit of complexity there. Whereas, for like our traversal system, moving across different nodes in the map, we were looking at a lot of, I think, JRPGs, how they do their overworld map design and have some inspiration from that. So yeah, trying to stand on the shoulders of giants a little bit as we go, rather than just start with a blank page and figure it out as we go along. Learn from the mistakes and lessons of others, but yeah, fitting it perfectly into a Aether Iron context is also a challenge in and of itself. An idea that worked for one reference game might not be so applicable because we don't have that system that game has, or we don't have that mechanic that game has. So you always got to sort of tweak and bend a little bit.
Yeah, I think that was something we instilled a lot of discipline with early as well, given that we have such a broad and diverse team, making sure that we were like, communication is like super important when it comes to developing games, and especially when you can probably tell we're sitting here in Australia. and much of the rest of the team is across the Northern America. So making sure our communication is nice and clear. And one of the early things was, okay, we're going to be drawing from wide references, but we're going to be really specific about what reference we're drawing from. It's easy to say something like Baldur's Gate 3, and we might mean a very specific point of that, but people's imagination can go really wild. So yeah, we're drawing from games like Forza, but just this special component here.
Yeah.
I think that was really, really helpful to get clear on that early on.
Yeah, I think what's been interesting from my perspective, being a relatively new member of this team, is just how much feedback you're having to give to the player in menus like this, and like how you've integrated the feedback to make things a lot more clear, because there's a lot of mechanics going on in this game. And I remember plenty of times you'd either gotten outside feedback or from us of like, how can we kind of make this more obvious to the player? And yeah, were there any like standout ones that were maybe a challenge, or like ones that you're like, oh, duh, like why didn't we think of that before, kind of things?
Yeah, look, I think the combat UI, the UI in general, has undergone quite a lot of iteration over the last couple of years. We're probably on the major iteration 3 of the combat UI. We used to have the turn queue on the left-hand side, and the character sort of more centered on the bottom in various iterations. I think the hazards and obstacles and the different grid highlights has... I've messed around with Cress's position here, which is why this is making a lot of sense. But is where we've had to do a lot of iteration to get the right sort of road signage and tooltips appearing in the corner when you highlight over things correctly, everything being synced between what's in the turn queue and what's on the grid. Yeah, I think just a lot of play testing and a lot of feedback and a lot of tinkering with stuff that is hopefully making some incremental improvements. I think
For sure.
areas of the dialogue UI, probably on about major iteration 3 of that as well. Where dialogue used to be centered and the characters were on the left and right talking to each other, and then we shifted it to be more right-aligned dialogue, so it looked like the characters were having more of a conversation rather than sort of oppositionally on either side of this dialogue feed. But yeah, I think not being afraid to playtest early and get some of that more critical feedback and realize, when it's not hitting the mark, and trying to filter through that feedback and, listen for the problem rather than take the solutions at face value. Sorry. A lot of people might playtest something and be like, oh, I hate this part of the combat UI, you should do this. And it's like, well, maybe they hate it because they were looking for this piece of information that they couldn't easily find. And, like this context menu for combatants in combat, it sort of underwent a couple of redesigns as well to simplify the information that was here. Trying to make the game controller friendly actually sort of pushed us to really simplify some of the menus and pop-ups that we had, so that this was presenting in a way that's just a lot easier to navigate and scroll up and down with the controller. And I think some of those UX simplifications have also helped with readability across the board as well.
Nice. I kind of want to move on to some of the narrative and story stuff, but Gina, do you have any other questions on your end before we kind of swap topics?
I think some of the questions that we've had come in are more along those lines. So.
Okay, perfect. Are you guys cool to open up like one of the dialogue scenes?
Yeah. Wondering what's going to be best to show off there.
I'm personally curious how you guys have been setting up like the backgrounds, because coming from more of the art team, I know there's like tons of layers and effects and stuff you're playing with.
Yeah, let's pick a good one.
No spoilers, James.
Yeah. Raymond District, that's pretty safe. So we get these amazing PSDs, Photoshop documents from artists on the Seismic team, and are sort of setting those up in Unity to make them playable in-game. This is one of the White Street environments, the Raiment District. A big tall one, so like, you're only looking at kind of one portion of this big vertical image at a time. But you can see here, like, this is the environment almost prefab, and all of the different layers that come through from the PSD of just all of the different sprites. And we position them all so that they sort of match the layout, and a lot of these environments will include some effects, so I think we should be able to play directly in scene here. And so we'll do things like cause the laundry to sway in the wind, add a little bit of smoke coming out of this, or steam coming out of this sort of smokestack component of the environment at the top, add some, blue ether glow to some of the repulsor elements that we might see that are visible in some of these scenes. So yeah, there is a lot of technical artwork, I would say, that sort of so we can see it here, some of that smoke and steam that goes into setting up each of these environments, and importantly, all of the sort of colliders and different gameplay interactions for these as well, making sure that we've got the right layers and such set up in the scene. Let me hide that.
Is there any like Z depth, or is it completely flat? It looks pretty flat. Wow.
Except for some of the 3D particles. There's some scenes where we include some 3D elements, particularly some 3D vehicles and stuff like that. And it's been a fun challenge to like match perspective and lighting between a Photoshop document that obviously has lighting in a 3D scene that has no knowledge of that. And we'll just be utilizing different rendering order, like layers and tags in Unity to make sure that stuff in the foreground is rendering over the top, 3D assets in the midground and stuff like that as well. But yeah, it's all sort of sorting the layers and elements of the PSD here into various like foreground, background, and midground elements so that we can make sure that they're all layering correctly, and going and setting hundreds of different sprite orders here to make sure that everything's coming through and rendering in the right layers, so that there's no Z fighting going on as well.
Few locations that change across the game or as a result of certain events, so that's an extra level of complexity there as well.
Interesting. Yeah, and we've got a range of different components, I suppose, we've built that Dean and other members of the team are primarily sort of going in and setting up the narrative content. So there's different passes of design, doing a pass over trying to get story content hooked up in a location, and the technical artists on the Chaos Theory team getting some of the amazing looking assets from Seismic artists and getting those playable in game as well, often as sort of two separate passes. But we have a range of these different sort of points of interest in a scene, and so someone like Dean would be going through and adding all of these different, this is going to be a bark, this one's going to trigger this conversation, this one should only be active when the player's up to this quest, and this character only has something to say when the player's, got this item or completed this objective or things like that. So there's a lot of sort of configuration in each environment as well that's, linking this bark to that sort of narrative asset, or linking this character to that conversation. This one will drive this conversation over here and things like that, which is sort of integrating that story content into some of these environments.
Yeah, some nice tools and things that we built on top of the standard Unity setup. My favorite is the characters. Being able to drop a new character into the scene. We've got a really lovely workflow there. You bring a character in, the moment you say, this one's Nelly, the art gets set up immediately. It drags that asset in. It makes sure that everything's named correctly. And then Artisy is what we're using to manage all the actual storing of the dialogue and where all the words are. But you set the conversation up in Artisy, and the moment you bring your character in, if there's a valid conversation that should be firing in this location at this time, it's all fired up and ready to go. So that's always a fun moment, dropping a new character in and being able to hit play and have a chat with them immediately.
That's amazing. Yeah, I was curious how you... Oh, I see. Okay. Huh. So it's just like a prefab character that you pull in, and then they have everything just automatically hooked up.
Yeah, you just
Yeah,
link
I'd
up
say
their sort of character data, which has all
Uh,
of the references to what their art and avatar is, and then the system will know for a particular save file, for a particular character, for a particular location, what might this character have to say to you at this point in time. So sort of all of that is automatically referenced without having to say, oh, when you click on this specific character, trigger this specific conversation.
so because I know we have like a bajillion lines of dialogue. Is Artisy like an external
Two bajillion,
program
I
that
think.
you implement you like write the script or the dialogue? Do you attach VO through that as well too?
Yeah, so Odyssey is a little bit like this. It's sort of like
Okay.
a node graph editing tool that all of the writers use in order to author content that goes into the game. So we can see like all of the different conversations that we have and how they're all hooked up and integrated. You can have different conditions across all of these as well. And then on the Unity side, we'll typically be sort of exporting all of the Artisy content, importing that in Unity. And then there's a whole in Unity representation of all of those dialogue trees as well, that has a few things that happen on import, like assigning some particular characters or commands, or sort of processing some stuff that comes in Artisy as well. But yeah, we have sort of a representation of that branching dialogue database in this Unity sort of dialogue tree as well, and we're interacting or integrating with a lot of that when we're hooking these up in environments and locations.
Wow. Yeah, that's a lot. That's a lot going on.
I think
Sure is.
somewhat related to this, sort of all the organization that goes into the development of a game. Dr. Entropy here on Discord asked, what are some of the habits or rituals during your time programming, audio mixing, or designing? The sorts of things that keep you on track, the schedules that you keep, the ways that you overcome blocks, and keep yourself from burnout.
Big question.
Quite a big question.
Yeah, I think probably different habits and rituals depending on which part, like whether you're programming or designing or working on audio. I think working as part of a team is a really nice way to overcome blocks. If I'm getting stuck, for other producers on our team that I can go and ask or share what I'm stuck or rubber duck something with and maybe figure out a way past it. If Dean's muscling through a design problem and we're unsure about do we want to do A or B, let's present it to the group and see what the feedback is. So I think that's one of the advantages of working in a smaller team like ours. You can kind of know everyone that's working on the project and ask them all for opinions. But if you are working on your own game or maybe solo deving, I think having that professional network of people who you can ask feedback from or share your latest build to and get some feedback on is also super important. I think we've developed a lot of little rituals over the 14 years that I've been in game dev so far. But yeah, I think trying to be very practical and pragmatic about sort of breaking down tasks into more manageable chunks. I come from the production side, so I spend a lot of time in Jira and in spreadsheets, and there's a lot of creating tasks and managing tasks that the team are working on, but making sure that people understand what a task entails and the bounds of that. It might be this thing, but we're only going this far at this point in time, or you're actually going to be integrating with this artist's work at this stage in that task, or we want to get this to an MVP level of completion and we're going to polish it later. I think establishing all of those parameters is important, and then we can sort of help use that information to plan out, well, here's what I aim to get done today. We have a system, a chaos theory that we've developed over the years. I think it actually started in COVID because we were kind of forced to, because we weren't doing daily stand-ups anymore, but a sort of check-in and a check-out at the end of every day. And so everyone on the team will sort of check in with, well, here's what I'm aiming to get done today, specifically this task and this task, or I want to get this one to 50% complete. I want to get a playable mission in Aether Iron that I can play end to end by the end of today. And so check out at the end of the day, which also helps the rest of the team know, oh, this person's in and online and available now, or they've finished for the day and here's where they got to, without having to have a meeting with the whole team every day to run through all of that information. I think has been super valuable.
I think like ownership is very important. Like James is saying, clarity around. So when James as a producer comes and says, puts a task together, James is working to make that nice and small and granular and make sure everyone understands it. But it's not a one-way street. It's not a matter of here's the task that you must do, go off and do it. You have James as a resource to be able to say, you don't have to feel embarrassed to say, can we be clearer about this point? I don't understand what to do here. Let's work through it together. So having that point of like collaboration, and even on the design side as well, it's important that I have design ownership because, at the end of the day, buck needs to stop somewhere. But as much as possible, everything should be collaborative. And that's a benefit of working in these small teams as well, so that everyone gets to have their input and their ideas in there. And we can't do everything, but you can understand everyone's perspective to make sure that it is represented and captured, because you don't have to be a member of the design team to be able to have really good and valid feedback into that design process and the game that we're making.
We got a question from Biaro. How would you define the core loop of gameplay? What keeps the player motivated?
Yeah, this has gone through a whole lot of iteration and change over time, which is how things go. So I don't know, maybe I'll talk about the history of this a little bit. We imagined, I think in the early days, that our missions would be a little bit smaller and a little more granular. But as we started to develop more of the game and the narrative started to come together as well, it became clear that we were telling more of an epic story about Gia and her impact on the world and the kind of community and people that she goes around her. And so these little missions started to become bigger, chunkier pieces. So we originally imagined that the player would be going out from their hall, the home base. You spec your car up, you grab a few items, you head out into the world, and you might take on a couple of missions, and then find your way back home when you need to repair and drop off some gear and things like that. That core loop hasn't changed too much, but very much the quest flow is what's driving that loop a lot now. So the player will go out. We've been making sure that we pace and scope these quests to be, you can probably get through 1 or 2 quests in a gameplay session. We know that some players are going to really fall in love with it, or you've got those days where you go, today I'm not doing anything, I'm just, playing my favorite game. So you can definitely dive into it deeper. But part of the pacing, part of the development certainly has been considering how players are going to be playing this and making sure that you've got those easy moments to go, okay, I've had a really great revelation. I've hit this amazing moment in the narrative. A good spot to, maybe save, or maybe I'll head back to the hole first, or do a little bit of inventory management, have a speak with some of my characters there, and maybe go and have a little rest now.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think early on, Dean did a good job of setting some parameters of, before we had built all of this, what do we want that core gameplay loop to be, and sort of breaking that down as let's imagine it being, a 45-minute session or something like that a player will play this game for, and they'll spend 30% of their time in dialogue or reading, and they'll spend another 30% of their time in combat, 2 different combat encounters that take 5 or 7 minutes each or something like that to resolve, and they'll spend another portion of their time, exploring the world and environments, and they'll spend maybe another portion of their time back at base in menus and sort of configuring gear and upgrades to plan for sort of the next iteration. And so setting some high level parameters of what do we want that player experience loop to be. And as Dean mentioned, as we sort of built more and more of it, maybe those percentages shifted a little bit. Maybe instead of that 45-minute loop being the player goes and completes sort of 1 and 2 missions and comes back, it's they'll make major progress on one main story mission and then sort of come back or have a different rest point. But yeah, I think that core loop has also been quite evolutionary, although I think it's been pretty well defined for the last year or so of development, probably at least. And as they mentioned, earlier on, we were seeing a lot more like randomly driven story events potentially that took place on those missions. And after building some of that and playing through it, some of the narrative feedback was that the story was feeling a little bit disjointed, or it was hard to connect these random events in meaningful ways, or you kept getting interrupted by a different random event as you were making progress towards a different quest that you had started. And so that's where that push to have these maybe longer, more epic, and more missions where we could do a lot more solid character development and hear a lot more from some of the NPCs that we're interacting with came from, instead of those random encounters ended up playing maybe a little bit more like almost what was the reference, like Inscription or Slay the Spire, like when you're moving along the map and you just get a little one dialogue beat and what do you want to do about this, and then move on to the next one. And so there are a lot more short and punchier sort of interactions, whereas now I think we're putting a lot more of our character development to the foreground and having a lot of opportunities to understand what Gia and sometimes Nellie's perspective on this event in the world is as we're moving across the map. But yeah, I think answering the second point of Ara's question there, what keeps the player motivated, I think it is a very narrative driven experience, and so that connection with the protagonist and that connection with Gia's role in the overall story is what is driving, I think, a lot of that motivation. There's intrigue, there's drama, there's tension, and you want to find out what happens next as a result of completing that next quest objective, in a similar way to maybe how like a TV show or a movie is structured. Like there's a scene and an act and a beat and a payoff, and you're like, oh, okay, how is this going to resolve? So it is a very narrative-driven sense of player motivation, I think, but with a strong strategic underpinning where on top of the narrative-driven loops that's sort of maybe providing that primary motivation for why I want to continue, there's also, I'm leveling up and I'm going to have more sort of talent points to spend to get these new abilities, so I'm going to sort of increase a sort of sense of power in combat, or more capability in some of these different talent checks and choices, and I'm able to acquire more gear or better vehicles, and so some of those more economic progression loops are also providing a sense of motivation. Well, if I can complete this next mission, then I'll get enough money to be able to afford this upgrade, and if I can do that, then I'm able to take on these big baddies in a little bit more of a fair fight or something like that. So yeah, I think some of the
come from like testing and just kind of seeing during the gameplay beats, like where does it feel good to like give the player a bit of a break, or like is it a timing thing, or what?
I think it did. Yeah, I mean it has to start with a direction, and Dean and Tyler, Dean is the sort of design lead and Tyler is the narrative lead, did a lot of work early on in the project figuring out what did we want that player experience to feel like, and sort of let's design in that direction. But then,
like
I think
we
it does
know
come...
that we wanted these kind of ebbs and flows. You
Mhm.
can't just go 0 to 100 and just sit there. You need to, and like there's a lot of like emotionality in the game. We draw the player through like ups and downs and things as well. So knowing though that we have this home base, which is this safe environment, nothing's going to surprise you. You know what to expect, and if you want to really relax and take things slow, that's the place to do it. So knowing that we wanted to be using that as part of the gameplay loop, so then when having discussions around the narrative, we know that we want the player to be coming back here. And so then the narrative is thinking about what are these moments where we have a really heightened point of excitement. Okay, probably after that is a time when we'll come back to the whole. So how do we make sure that the narrative is adapting for that? And I don't want to spoil anything, but as we move through more of the game, there are some like big events that really build over a number of different missions. And knowing that like you pull off this certain things and you're kind of sweating an edge of the seat, and it's like that's the perfect time to now go, and Gia and the crew are probably quite excited to get off the island and come back somewhere nice and safe. I mean, I'm always looking for synergy between the player's feelings and knowledge and emotion and the character's feelings and knowledge and emotion. As much as you can get the player and Gia to be thinking and feeling the same thing, if you can do that, you're golden. Like, if anyone is looking for the game development narrative tips, that's what it all comes down to. Have Gia asking the same questions, investigating the same leads the player is asking and investigating of themselves. And yeah, those same moments where Gia goes, geez, I really want to get off this island, where it's so the danger disappears, the player's thinking the exact same thing.
Yeah.
I've got a lot of loot that I'm trying to, keep safe as well. So yeah, really great to be working with the narrative team and a team that really get it as well.
Yeah, I was just thinking too, because you have to do so much collaboration, but I know that it's very easy, especially from the narrative side, to like spiral into some crazy idea that they want to execute. So how do you guys balance like what's actually feasible on the development side compared to some of the ideas that are coming in? Like, yeah, what is that process like?
I think James said the word earlier, pragmatic, like trying to take a really pragmatic approach, like understand that there's going to be scope implications to everything, and that we can't do everything, and the opportunity cost. If we want to pursue this one really cool idea, well, it probably means that we're not going to be pursuing other things. And so having all that kind of thinking is very important, because this one cool idea that might eat up, we've got 3 cool ideas. Well, one of them might mean that we can actually still do these other things at the same time. So that can lead towards some of that. Now, that needs to be balanced with space for freedom of just going crazy.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you never do anything special if you never kind of strive for it. So I think it's a lot of I like to think about or talk about something, if anyone wants to look up the graph, the double diamond approach, which is about going through convergent, so thinking crazy, getting all kinds of ideas, and then divergent and then convergent thinking. So time, when you go, okay, everyone, this is it, get all the craziest things you can think of out. You're riffing off each other, like someone says something nuts and you go, what if we push it even further and even further? And then making sure we have time to bring that back down to the pragmatic and what's mostly achievable. And again, that comes down to practice and communication. Something James didn't quite touch on, but talking about turning tasks into small pieces. The more that you can be moving things through the process, the more that people understand that this is how the machine works, this is the cadence. We don't end up like ever completing a week where we feel like, what did we achieve? We didn't finish anything. Like every week, every day where we've got tasks that are small enough where we're making progress. And if every day you complete a set of tasks, that means in a week you completed, a dozen or more tasks. And that builds confidence in that process as well. So yeah, people do know that, okay, this is the time to have crazy thoughts, and then we're going to be slapped down a little bit towards reality. People talk about killing your babies. You can't get too married to any of these ideas. I maybe that language is a little bit too aggressive, but you do need to have this. You've got to like see the potential in the game. Like that's the first step as a developer, because the game isn't good until it is. But you need to see like, oh, if we do this and we do this, we're going to be able to build this thing that doesn't exist yet into something better. But then still have that discipline of like having that emotional distance, not getting too married to your ideas, because very often that idea that you love so much, well, like you're full of ideas and that was just your first one. You're going to love the next idea you come up with even more. And coming back to that collaboration, like don't do this stuff in isolation. You've got to be bouncing off other people, and you end up with this like really wonderful mix that takes a lot of perspectives into account. And then we throw it to James, who scratches his head and goes, how the hell are we going to get this stuff done? But he finds a way.
Was there one of those crazy things that you guys were like, no, we got to get this in? I guess something that's obviously not a spoiler, but something you were really pushing for.
Something that's not a spoiler. Yeah, that's the hard part.
Yeah, I know of the crazy stuff that happens later on, but
I would say some of the roles of the characters. Hopefully that's not a spoiler. If you play the early game, if you play the demo, you get a sense of the kind of character that Nelly is, but also her background. And if we're thinking about Gia kind of building a community of people and she goes off to do something amazing, in what ways Nelly might be able to help the player? Because, she's not getting into combat directly. She's a little bit more meek and she's kind of the foil to Gia's self-assured kind of nature. But what's the knowledge and the skill set that Nelly might have that could help? So we definitely wanted to make sure that was well represented. And maybe I'll stop talking about that there.
Yeah, I think for a lot of the first maybe 12, 18 months of working together, it was quite ambiguous what those boundaries would be. A lot of push and pull between design and narrative of, can we do this? Should we do this? The White Street sort of chapter of the story, what we call Act 1, got sort of iterated on a fair few times from the narrative department to try and figure out a balance of what worked pacing-wise for the story. And there were things like the hero morale system that didn't exist until a lot later in the piece. There were things like the heat system, where your heat can increase or decrease based on certain actions, that didn't exist until later in the piece. And so we'd written chunks of the story without all of those systems existing, then had to maybe revisit some of those chunks of the story to integrate those different consequences or some different outcomes that could happen. And I think, it was a bit of an evolutionary process as well, figuring out what all of those things that we could do in a conversation might be, starting with a initial design and spec and set of tools. We had an idea of how we wanted our quest system to work and characters and character emotes and stuff like that. But yeah, I think probably in the last 6 to 9, maybe 6 to 12 months, that set of what is possible is a little bit more set in stone, and so that can be relied upon a little bit more to just write thousands and thousands of words of interesting story that knows that, well, here are the levers that we have to pull to affect the game and in what ways. I think to your question, Nick, one of the more interesting or challenging components is maybe like the combat cutscene system. Originally, we didn't have the ability to have different cutscene animations in combat. You'd go from the map into the beginning of a combat encounter, you'd finish a combat encounter and leave. And through developing a lot of these story beats, we wanted combat to feel more connected to the main story, like a natural consequence, rather than a punishment for making the wrong decision or just an inevitable outcome of a particular beat. And so there were probably about a third of the combat encounters in the game now have a bespoke cutscene that is trying to deliver some story that connects us from where we were on the map or where we were in a particular location to what's happening in this encounter. There's, Gia and an opponent throwing words at each other before we get into the sort of strategic encounter that plays out, or there's a sort of finale outcome where we see what happens to the opponent or the crew vehicles that have emerged from this encounter and how that leads into the next beat. And so understanding the limits of what we could or couldn't do with that animation system and how do we interject story with animations. There are certain conversations where you can make choices in dialogue that sort of influence what animation happens next. Does Gia, jump aboard the train or not, or things like this? So knowing what our parameters or limits of that was definitely a bit of a challenge to figure out. And I know we've had a lot of design and narrative workshops over the last year especially, but over the last while, of figuring out, what is the story purpose of each of these combat encounters and how can we allow the combat to support the story as much as possible and what's going to be useful there.
Yeah, those combat cutscenes, if those weren't there, it's like you'd feel it. It makes a big difference to just like telling the story and making everything a lot more visual. I was just thinking while you were talking, it's like everyone goes into game dev with a GDD. And they're like, this is going to be the game. And then you realize, like, as you're working on it, you're like, nah, it's maybe something a little bit different. So it's cool to hear that. It sounds like generally you guys had a solid foundation for what this game was, but all of the little things, like the user experience things, obviously evolve with, especially with a story-driven game, right? Like, you're having to take a whole other element beyond just playing to integrate and make it make sense with the playing, right? So,
Yeah.
did you
I
guys
think
have a
after like
GDD, or was it more like loose notes kind of stuff?
We had a
I think we
GDD.
we got
We had 60-page
thousands of words
mammoth to
of
begin with,
Yeah.
Confluence
and then
documents.
then much more. But I think that you need to be open to this iteration. Like, great things
Mhm.
are made, and we're not just talking about video games. Like, if you want, go and have a look at any art. Everything that is worthwhile is made through iteration. You think you know what you're going to build, you think you know what your skills and your team and your capabilities are, and your desires are, but you build a little bit, you reassess, you build a bit more, you reassess, and you just continue that process until one day someone says, this is the release date and we're going to hit it. So
Yeah,
that's
right.
the point that we are now. And then you get to do all kinds of fun things like this, like finally talk about the game and celebrate it with some other people. So that helps with the burnout as well, to answer the previous question, knowing that there's light at the end of the tunnel, that the system, there's a process, and, you know, making sure that you work with a team that's filled with compassionate people. I don't know how you manage that. We've managed it. Where, I don't know, maybe we're lucky, or maybe there's some secret sauce there. I'm not sure. And just keep going. Know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and it's a really bright light. And it results in putting something great out into the world that, like, people already are starting to like. It's been so great, like, having you both on board as well, Gina and Nick, and being able to, like, because we're busy, we've got stuff to be doing, but we still want to be keeping up to date with what's going on in the Steam forums, what people who are playing the demo are saying, and I just look for one word. I look for the word love. And when people say, like, we love what we're seeing, I love the game, or I love Gia, like, that strong emotion, like, that's what it's all about. Seeing that we've made a connection with people, that at the end of the day is what makes all of this worthwhile.
That's amazing. Well, we're wrapping up on the hour, and I think that was a very, very good way to close it out. Gina, do you have any? Are there any other lingering questions?
I did have one, more just for me. Since we did just have Steam Next Fest and we put our demo out for the world to play, were there any player strategies or pieces of feedback that came in that may have caught you off guard, or maybe change how you thought about balance or altered the course of the game in any way? I know that we are certainly in the iteration and polish stage of development, so we're not able to change a whole lot, but were there any things that came out of Steam Next Fest and the public demo that impacted the development of the game?
There are a few quality of life additions that I think we prioritized based on player input and feedback. We noticed a few pieces of player feedback, particularly around combat, and added a few accessibility settings to help with the amount of motion going on in certain combat scenes. There are a few other polish elements of certain inventory interactions not being as clear as they could be, or certain sort of like stats in vehicle comparison or ways to swap parts between vehicles not being as clear as they could be. I think the demo is intentionally a little bit of a taster, and so the strategic decisions don't quite build up too heavily in that 60, 90, 120 minutes of gameplay that you get in the demo. So we haven't necessarily seen too many winning strategies emerge, because for those first few combat encounters, they're sort of quite deliberately paced to be teaching you one new thing at a time, that most players are busy wrapping their heads around for a lot of that early gameplay. But yeah, we have seen, I think, some, as Dean was saying, a lot of resonance and feedback for a lot of love for the creative direction and visual execution, a strong sense of wanting to know what happens next in that story. So I think good reinforcement that some of those elements that we're hoping to really shine are obviously resonating with some people.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you guys want to leave the people watching with?
Probably a thank you.
Yeah, thanks
Sincerely.
for watching.
Yeah. Thanks for watching. Thanks for playing. Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you guys. This was very fascinating for me too. I really liked seeing the Unity stuff. That was cool. And yeah, thank you everyone else for joining in and watching. And we are going to do this again next week, as far as I know. So we'll see you next time, guys. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks,
Awesome.
everyone.
Thanks for joining.